Welcome back. In today's video, we'll be looking at JSON Web Tokens. We'll learn how to create a token and use it to authenticate and authorize your API. In Visual Studio, I've created a blank solution. I've added a client project to generate the token, an API project that will use the token to authorize an endpoint, and a shared class library. You will also need to install these NuGet packages. In the app settings for both project, I've added a section called JWT. This section contains three properties: issuer, audience, and secret. I will use the JWT options class in the shared project to map these settings as iOptions. Let's start by creating the JWT token in the client project. Firstly, we'll bind our app settings section to the JWT options class. Now we can retrieve them by injecting them into our getToken endpoint. Now let's create our token generator function. Add a new class and call it JWT. Create a static function called generate with three string parameters called issuer, audience, and secret, and finally an integer parameter called TTL. This last parameter will determine, in minutes, the lifetime of the token. Next, we'll create our signing credentials using our secret. We will also create a couple of claims. For this example, I'm just going to add a GUID value and an admin role. We will use this role later as part of the authorization process in the API project. Create the token using the function parameters, signing credentials, and claims. Now we can write the token and return it as a string value. From our getToken endpoint, we can generate the token using the values configured in the app settings. I'm going to use Swagger to call the getToken endpoint to retrieve our new token. From here, I can simply copy the token ready to use when calling our API. From a browser, type jwt.io. Paste in your token to view it. You should be able to see the roles you added, along with the issuer, audience, and expiry value. Okay, now we've created our token, we can switch to the API project. Before we add the authentication and authorization code, let's run it and call the endpoint from Postman. The Postman response returns some data with an OK status of 200. Now let's go back to the project and add the authentication and authorization code. Make sure the JWT section in App Settings mirrors the settings in the client project. Grab the settings and store them to a variable. Add the JWT authentication service and configure the token validation parameters using the options variable. Now add the authorization service. Then enable the application to use authentication and authorization. And finally add authorization to the endpoint. Now let's run the application again, calling the endpoint from Postman without supplying a token. This time Postman shows an unauthorized status code of 401, and no data is returned. Now let's try the request using a JSON Web Token. Once again, I'm using Swagger to generate a new token. Copy the new token. From Postman, select the Authorization tab. From the drop-down menu, select Bearer Token, and paste in your new JSON Web Token. Now when you send the request, you receive an OK response and your data. But what about that admin role? For that, we need to make a couple of slight changes. The first change is to modify the authorization service by adding a policy for our role. Then include that policy in the endpoint the role authorizes. Postman will once again return an authorized response. You can test the response for failure by changing the required role value in the authorization policy. If you liked this video and found it informative, please give a like and subscribe.